This is a seminar series as part of the Collaboratory of Coastal Adaptation over Space and Time, also known by its acronym CCOAST. And the idea is that we bring different speakers from different academic disciplinary backgrounds to teach each other about the main ideas, theories, methods, and applications in our individual disciplines, and how that might eventually stimulate more interdisciplinary research on these challenging problems relating to governing the coast. So today, I'm really pleased to introduce two speakers. We will have, each speaker will talk for about 20 minutes, then there will be a Q&A in between. And please send your questions via the chat to Catherine Anardi, our host, and she will then call on you to ask your question or read your question aloud on your behalf. So our first speaker today is Elizabeth Frankenberg, who is a professor of sociology and public policy and the director of the Carolina Population Center at UNC Chapel Hill. Professor Frankenberg has a background, PhD in demography and sociology, and a lot of experience collaborating on interdisciplinary teams, including with economists and public health experts. And she'll be speaking to us today about household surveys and coastal resilience. Our second speaker today, Scott Hemmerling, is the director of the Human Dimensions of the Water Institute of the Gulf. Scott's PhD is in geography and is specifically a cultural geographer, and also an interdisciplinary researcher who's worked very extensively on coastal resilience and a number of environmental justice issues. So I'm pleased to welcome Elizabeth and Scott, and I will turn it over to Elizabeth to share your screen and take it away.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. All right. Okay, people seeing my screen? Great. All right, I'm gonna try to make this a little smaller and move things around a little. Okay, so I want to talk about household surveys as a tool for studying resilience, and I approach this very much as a demographer and a sociologist, but have worked a lot with geographers and economists, I guess, in particular. And there are really a lot of disciplines that use surveys. Household surveys are probably a little more concentrated in some of the social science disciplines. So the disciplines that use these tools involve, the ones listed, political science and anthropology and psychology as well, although not so much necessarily household surveys per se. And there are a lot of parallels with field-based methods of natural sciences, which has been kind of an interesting way to get at interdisciplinary angles to these. So what I wanted to do today was give, a really sort of brief, basic overview of kind of key aspects of the method of surveys and household surveys, and then do a little bit with examples to sort of fix your mind on how we've used these in a particular project. So, what are the key elements? Well, one of the things that you need to do first off, particularly if you're approaching this from a sort of population science perspective, is to identify the population you actually want to characterize. What is that underlying population? Is it a state? Is it a country? Is it particular ecological zones? And then how do you design a strategy for sampling from that population? So population scientists really care about being representative and capturing a subset of cases that well represent that underlying population. You then need to draw a sample from that frame. That can be really simple, like a simple random sample, or it can be stratified in some way to under or overrepresent particular groups you may care about. Constructing a questionnaire, or really sort of the constructs that you want to measure, and then how you're going to translate those academic constructs into a set of questions or measurement devices that you can implement in the field, and then ultimately obtaining data from the selected households. And some of the times you might do that, really with face-to-face visits. Other times this might be a web-based survey or mail or some other kind of mode. So there are a lot of kind of design elements to designing the data collection and then actually implementing it. So, what determines the quality? A big question is whether your sample really represents the underlying population. And that could be because your frame excluded certain people that you really don't want to exclude. It could also be that you have gotten really differential response. And so not everybody that you've tried to talk to has wanted to answer. And the people who said no or couldn't be found are different systematically in some way, and that's problematic. And then another important element is whether your questions and measurement strategies capture key constructs. It won't surprise many of you to hear that there are human subjects considerations, and part of doing a quality survey is also taking care of your respondents and treating them in an ethical way. And there are lots of sort of safeguards and checks in place through institutional review boards to make sure that happens. So, that's kind of like super basic intro to what people try to do with surveys, and in particular with sort of thinking about household surveys that are population representative. There are a lot of ways that you can supplement surveys by adding, we'll just call bells and whistles. So asking people questions and recording their answers is one way to get data, but in different contexts, there are administrative records that may be relevant. You may design tasks of some form, and psychologists do this a lot to measure performance in some way. We also actually do that with different health constructs. You might actually collect blood or saliva and do tests of health status as well. So, one way to supplement just kind of a standard ask a question, record the answer is with those sorts of extra data. Something we've done a lot is collecting contextual data. So economists care a lot about markets and, what are prices and what are wages. Environmental scientists care a lot about aspects of the natural environment, water quality and things like that. Longitudinal surveys do interviews over time, same people over time typically, to understand change over time. You can also design the sample around an event so that one has sort of before and after data, and consider whether there are ways to build in comparison populations, groups for which the event is irrelevant or a lot less relevant. And, these last 2 points start to get at building a survey in the context of trying to harness the power of a natural experiment for understanding, exogenous changes. So I'm going to turn now to an example project that I've been involved with for a really long time. And that is a coastal context that is not the US or North Carolina, but is actually Indonesia. And so the event that we've tied this particular project to was the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, which took place on December 26th. So that tsunami was precipitated by an enormously powerful earthquake. It actually moved the magnetic location of the North Pole by a couple of centimeters, and there was a 1,200 kilometer unzipping of the tectonic plate boundaries. And so let's see if I can get my mouse. This is where that unzipping occurred. The water moved in every ocean, and ultimately tsunami waves kind of slammed into the coastlines of countries, 26 different countries rimming the Indian Ocean. So Indonesia is here, and that's the area that was hardest hit. And we've worked for years now in the province of Aceh. So in Aceh, Indonesia, 200,000 people, that was about 5% of the population of that particular province. Many houses destroyed, and about 750,000 people were actually displaced. And so this is an image maybe a month or so after the tsunami came ashore, which really looks almost lunar. Some tall trees remain, but really very little else. And some of the white spots you can see are rubble from foundations. So we've used high resolution satellite imagery a lot to try to characterize tsunami damage, and that's where some of the geographic methods come in. This is an image before the tsunami of a particular village on the West Coast. Beautiful place, and great beach, but also tree crops, aquaculture ponds, roads, and houses. This is what it looked like 2 weeks after the tsunami. So the much of the land cover reduced to bare earth, but idiosyncratic local impacts, partially as a function of altitude. So one of the things that happened in Aceh was an enormous reconstruction program, totaling some $7 billion that spilled out over 7 years. And, this is a slide that I love. Same village 5 years later. It's a little bit darker. Fascinating geological processes. The beach has rebuilt itself. Surprised me, may not surprise some of the geologists. The aquaculture ponds are not back. The water's too deep there, but roads and bridges are. That big road was actually built by USAID. They had to reroute it because of the change in the water. Some of the houses and crops are back. So we've built a project using household survey methods around this survey. And I'll tell you a little bit about that because it sort of encapsulates some of those design elements I talked about initially. So timeline, the tsunami occurred here right at the end of 2004. We worked with Statistics Indonesia, their statistical agency, to get access to a survey that had been conducted before the tsunami, 10 months before. That kind of served as our baseline. And what we wanted to do was follow up individuals in communities in the aftermath of that. So our baseline was about 26,000 people. It was a household survey, so it was everybody in these households, about 7,000 households, I guess. So full age range. And we did 7 follow-up surveys annually. And then we switched to a less frequent time frame, doing one 10 years later, a subsample in 2016-17 that really emphasized detailed health and cognitive measurements, and then another survey 2019-20, so about 15 years after. In longitudinal surveys, recontact is important. We interviewed about 96% of survivors at least once. We have a pretty detailed questionnaire, household composition, but also a lot on economic resources, psychosocial health, and things like health-related things like sleep, loneliness, social support, and networks, and also what people experienced in the tsunami. When we added our biomarker component, that included things like height and weight, blood pressure, and then for a subsample, we did venous blood to measure particular markers of cardiometabolic dysregulation. So I am going to sort of whiz through some of the results. First, I'll show you a map. So this is the northern end of the island of Sumatra. We work in 2 provinces, Aceh and North Sumatra. We originally focused on 487 communities that participated in the baseline survey. People spread out from that, but those dots represent communities in red that were in heavily damaged areas and in blue that were not. And so you can see there this kind of comparison idea where we've got some communities heavily damaged, others experiencing little to no impact. So what do we learn from this household survey framework kind of built around a before-after, a big event with a before-after component and comparison areas? Well, I'll show you first mortality. So we knew who was alive in the 2004 survey. We went back in 2005 to find out who survived. In the following slides, the blue lines will represent outcomes for people from the relatively undamaged areas. Red lines will indicate damage in the heavily damaged areas. So mortality is low, but rises with age in the undamaged area in that year between the baseline and the first post-tsunami follow-up. For people from heavily damaged areas, story totally different. 30% on average of individuals from these communities lost their life in that year, most of them, of course, because of the tsunami, but a differential pattern by age and by sex. Prime age males at lower risk than prime age females, but children and the elderly much more vulnerable than older adults. So, that's the first thing that we measured is sort of mortality from the event itself. But because we tracked these people over time and had this broad ranging set of survey questions, we can also look at a couple of other types of outcomes. So this next slide just shows you levels of post-traumatic stress reactivity and how they fell over the first 5 years. Elevated in both areas of heavy damage or for respondents who were originally from those areas, and for respondents from other areas, but a slow decline over time in those levels. And so by 2008 or so, there's actually not a statistically significant difference between those who were in the tsunami in heavy damage areas versus other areas. We've done a lot with different measures of economics, wages, income, assets. Those are time consuming to collect. We also ask people to compare their own perceptions of their socioeconomic status after the tsunami relative to before the tsunami. And if you sort of follow that out over time, what you see is sort of not surprisingly a big dip in your sort of relative sense of economic well-being around the year of the survey, around the time of the survey, and that first post-tsunami survey of 2005, but a quick upward return towards 2007. The red areas, people from the red areas don't fully recover, but the gap is much diminished over time. And one of the nice things about this particular measure, although it's a little weird, is that everyone can answer it. You don't have to be working and have a job. You don't have to be relying on someone from your household on income. You know, this is something that is relevant for people, regardless of whether they're in the labor force or not. The effects are pretty similar for income and spending if you use some of the, the other types of measures of economic status. So another thing that happened, we started with this slide that showed you an area, this was really sort of ground zero of the tsunami hitting, was a gradual restoration to things that looked more normal. So this is a different area about 9 months after the event, some vegetation starting to come back. No houses rebuilt yet, some people still camping out. But 5 years later, reconstruction housing has been put in place. And in fact, the reconstruction effort resulted in 140,000 homes being built over 5 years. And so we also sort of track what goes on with that. For our respondents, about 20% receive an assistance home. That's a full 80% for those whose homes were destroyed. Receipt was actually less likely among those with more resources before the disaster. So it's not a context in where sort of elite capture of these assistance programs was an enormous problem, at least for the housing reconstruction element. Among those who received a home, we looked at post-traumatic stress reactivity. And among recipients, we sort of document a significant decline in levels of post-traumatic stress reactivity after receipt of that home. So psychosocial benefits of that recovery program. That effect is particularly concentrated among those whose home was destroyed. So I'm going to stop with the results from Indonesia and just say briefly, well, what does this have to do with coasts in the US? That is what a project that I've been working on with some of the folks on the call for a couple of years now is trying to kind of, in part do, is take these household survey methods and apply them in the context of the coastal US. This is Englehart in Hyde County after Hurricane Florence. Similar sort of situation of a massive influx of water damaging resources on the land. And so we have started to apply these household survey methods in 4 different counties in Eastern North Carolina. One of the super exciting things about the North Carolina work is that, as you guys all know, you are those people. There are lots of natural scientists who are really interested in and engaged in this work as well. And so it has been a great vehicle for trying to combine the natural and the social in ways that I was never totally successful with in the Indonesia work, much as I would have liked to measure soil salinization and some of those other things. Okay, I'm probably over time. I'm in my screen sharing vacuum, so I'm going to stop sharing and see if there are questions.
Thanks, Elizabeth. You're not actually over time. I didn't get a chance to put this in the chat, but if you have a question for Elizabeth, you can either post it in the chat or you can send it to me directly if you can't ask the question yourself. You can also just raise your hand if it's possible for you to ask your question directly to Elizabeth. That seems to be a more conversational way of doing the Q&A. So first I see that Reed's raised his hand, and then there are a couple in the chat. So Reed, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Sure, thanks. Appreciate the presentation and really interesting area to focus some of that work on.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about when trying to put a survey out, not necessarily in that environment in Indonesia, but maybe along our coastal areas. What is a best method. I feel like I'm inundated with surveys, and I realize sort of that personal touch one-on-one is different than, you know, the emails we get. My guess is, depending on
Yeah.
how you, this shows, you know, the fact that I have no experience in this whatsoever.
Yeah.
Depending on how you try to get those surveys out there, my guess is they're
Yeah.
received differently by different socioeconomic areas.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great question. And, you know, response rates are typically a lot higher in lower middle income countries than they are in the US. And that's one of the things that US really has to, and developed countries really have to worry about. So I didn't know how this was going to work when we started trying it, but we decided, partially because our instruments are relatively complex, to go with, you know, face-to-face in-person visits. And interestingly to me, the same kind of approach that we use in Indonesia has actually worked pretty well, which is just shoe leather cost, you know, get out there, make it as convenient as possible, be as friendly as possible. We did a lot of initial community outreach, and, you know, talking to people. We took out radio ads, newspaper ads, and, you know, do our best to kind of have a pitch that explains why we think it's important, and then go from there. And it, you know, not, you know, partially because of COVID, it has taken longer than we had hoped, but it has ultimately been pretty successful in our pilot site. We're working now in 3 additional sites. You know, another thing we did is recruit and train local interviewers. So we've used a mix of local interviewers and students. I really love having the local interviewers involved, and that's been super helpful. So, you know, we're kind of working on those methods, but so far I'd say it's not a disaster. I'm not a fan, well, of sort of mail back surveys. We are actually going to build some web-based surveying capacity, because that is going to be a better way for some people. And also on our coast, of course, there are many people who own property but are not resident there. And that's one of the better ways to reach them potentially. So we're kind of, you know, that's a work in progress, but I am cautiously optimistic right now. And definitely not quitting.
All right, thanks, Elizabeth. Rachel, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Sure. Hi, thanks so
Hi.
much. So I
Sure.
asked in the chat, and this is, I guess, sort of for a specific project I'm working on, but have you ever been in a situation where, like, you're not exactly sure who you're surveying or where they are, and have you used methods to sort of bound sort of geographically or jurisdictionally where you'll be going? Because I haven't seen literature on that.
Yeah, so there are different ways to do that. Some people have kind of pioneered satellite imagery on which you can actually recognize distinct buildings to draw samples of those structures from satellite imagery. We're not doing that. You know, we took the tax parcel data, which is pretty imperfect, but because we have this on the ground presence, we can sort of validate it as we go. So, and you know, what we're trying to do with our sample is, it's a little wonky, to use a technical term, but you know, we selected counties that have different ecological features and different sort of socio-demographic features, and then we're trying to capture you know, a representative group within those places, without necessarily you know, being dominated by urban residents or places like that. So we really care a lot about the sparsely populated places as well as the heavily populated places.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, next question, Megan.
Thanks. This was super interesting. And I was struck by one comment you made from your work in Indonesia about that you found in the housing reimbursements, the rebuilding, that there didn't seem to be the capture of resources that you might expect or that you might find in other settings. And I'm wondering, like, in your work there and in your work here, how much transport do you have between the households that you're studying and their institutional or community or policy context? And, you know, how do you address that both methodologically and sort of substantively? What kinds of questions are you asking
Mhm.
where you're sort of drawing kind of contextual policy conclusions from the household surveys, you know, from the households that you're studying?
Yeah, so so in Indonesia, we designed and implemented sort of a companion community facility survey to go along with household survey. And so that provides a lot of contextual information. We go to markets to get at prices so we can track inflation during the rebuilding period. We go to health facilities to see what kinds of services they're able to offer. We interview in Indonesia what would be sort of the village leader or the community leader about all sorts of things, including the rollout of the rebuilding program. So that's where a lot of that information comes from in Indonesia in terms of contextual information. They don't have the same insurance market that we have, and so there was more flexibility perhaps in providing access to housing assistance. And they did something quite interesting, which was only provide pretty small houses. And so for poorer people, those houses were a distinct upgrade from what they'd been living in before, whereas for richer people, they were not. And, you know, one of the things you see over time is sort of like the emergence of, you know, the McMansion as the wealthier people build on to their, you know, fairly basic assistance housing initially. So we're trying to do that to some extent in the North Carolina work. And, you know, one of the things we did is build in kind of FEMA-oriented questions around mitigation measures that people might not or might have adopted. So read the FEMA manual and think, okay, how do I ask about these things that FEMA recommends you do to protect yourself from flooding? And did you do it before this hurricane? Have you done it since then? You know, things like that. We ask about insurance coverage because that is, you know, super important. And, you know, I've just started looking at results from that. You know, if you know anything about the flood insurance program, you all better know whether people have a mortgage. So we ask about that so that we can stratify our results by way in which you came to own the home. So there have been interesting things. I mean, one of the things I didn't quite plan for was people whose asset is owning a trailer. They own the trailer, but not the land on which the trailer is located. And so we capture that, but not with quite as much precision as I would like. So, you know, we're kind of learning as we go. And it's one of the reasons that, you know, our first phase we've sort of conceived of as a pilot.
Okay, one last question, Amanda.
Yeah, and it may be, we may not have time for the full answer, but I was wondering if you could, and you started to get there a little bit with your last answer, but kind of what your overarching goal is for the Coastal Carolina project. You know, is there an ultimate answer you're trying to receive, or some of the components that you're really interested in looking at?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's not, I wouldn't say there's one question or one, you know, one driving question. And one of the sort of hallmarks of what we tend to call multi-purpose surveys is that they can be used by a lot of different people from a lot of different disciplines. So I would like to move away from kind of a property-oriented framework in terms of understanding damage to one that builds in more of the kind of physical and psychosocial health aspects, also the day-to-day disruption involved with sort of schools and rebuilding and restructuring. So that's one of the things that I'm super interested in, is pulling in that perspective a lot more. And then what I'd like to do is analyze the data and make it available in ways that would be of interest to, you know, North Carolina agencies that are working on these questions. So you know, so that's sort of one goal, but it is really meant to be kind of multi-purpose. I would also like to make it longitudinal, because I think another thing is, you know, we hear a lot about what these storms do, you know, in the first month, and then we hear relatively little else, you know, after some sort of summary estimates of amount of damage in dollars and which counties were affected. And I would like to do the surveys multiple waves to kind of look at the recovery process. I think that's understudied. You know, and then Miyuki's on the call. You know, another thing is, like, there are the extreme events, and it's really nice to survey questions to them because people can date those pretty precisely, but they're also the not extreme events, you know, that are causing inundation and changing ability of places. And we try to ask some questions around that as well.
All right, thanks so much, Elizabeth, and thank you all for questions. We're going to transition over to Scott Hemmerling from the Water Institute of the Gulf. We'll be talking about participatory modeling.
All right, I'm going to try to share my screen. You see my presentation?
It looks great.
Excellent, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. This is a great opportunity to talk about some of the work that we're doing in coastal Louisiana. As was mentioned earlier, I work with the Water Institute of the Gulf. We're a nonprofit 501c3 research institution located in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Really, part of our goal with the Institute is to take an interdisciplinary, or I guess the new term du jour is transdisciplinary approach to understanding a lot of these complex coastal situations that we have here in Louisiana. And we have a number of different sections or departments within the Institute. We have an ecology, applied geosciences, natural system modeling, and then our planning and human dimensions programs. And I bring this up as kind of an example, even though we're a small nonprofit, this kind of department structure, I think it applies very well to any university where you have all of these different disciplines in one area. So the methods that we're trying to develop, crossing disciplinary boundaries to address coastal issues, I think can be applied to any university or college. And I'm going to give some background on some of the issues we have here in Louisiana. I know in the Carolinas, probably a lot of this is not news to you, but down here we have lots of issues with land loss. We have sea level rise and subsidence. You can see down at the end of the Mississippi River Delta, some of the net land loss over time. We have issues with storm surge inundation, all of these issues that we see in a lot of these coastal areas. And obviously the climate is changing and the effects on some system components is well studied, but understanding these complex interactions and how these interactions affect communities is really vital to how we address these issues. So one way Louisiana is addressing it is through their coastal master plan. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on it, but just to kind of set some background and some of the knowledge controversies that kind of arise through this process. It's essentially a $50 billion, 50-year plan, very heavy on numerical modeling, where you look at a wide range of projects, how these projects interact with each other to both, build land and protect communities. So that's kind of writ large, the process behind the coastal master plan. And if we look at it, there's a lot of different project types, from barrier island restoration to marsh creation to structural and non-structural protection. But one thing I want to kind of do a little bit of a focus on is it's a small little portion of this, the sediment diversions in Louisiana. And I bring this up, this is out of all of the master plan, this is an extremely controversial, among the public, a controversial process. Now, the goal of sediment diversion is to use Mississippi River water, create an artificial fissure in the levee, and take the sediment-laden water into the wetlands and build land. It's estimated to create over 15,000 acres of land in this area. So in terms of maximizing land building, the diversion is, where the models show you get the most bang for your buck. Now, part of what happens when you take this water, fresh water from the Mississippi River, and you flush it into the wetlands with the sediment so the sediment can build, is you're putting it into a brash estuary. So you're taking fresh water, you're obviously changing the salinity gradients. So this area, and if we look at the blue area on this slide, sparsely populated, but who does live there are fishermen, oystermen. It's a very, very much people who are reliant on the environment. And I'm just going to put a quote out here from one of the residents of, one of the coastal parishes. I would think the only thing that would make people leave is if they cannot make a living shrimping, oystering, crabbing. Them not being able to make a living would probably be the only thing. We've seen people's houses be devastated and they still rebuild. So I put that quote out there just to highlight what is going on when you're changing the salinity gradient and you're affecting these local communities. So what I have here is St. Bernard Parish, which is kind of ground zero for one of the diversions. And there's been a couple ordinances passed recently And obviously we don't have to read all the text here, but essentially they issued a resolution opposing any additional freshwater or diversion projects or modifications in their county. And we have parishes in Louisiana, but that's the equivalent of counties in the rest of the country. And a later resolution requesting that the state delegation oppose any further spending on large-scale lower Mississippi River sediment diversions. So we have this issue where the way to build the land the most quickly is having this direct negative impact on community. It's creating these knowledge controversies and conflict between the state and local residents. So one thing we did at the Water Institute was develop this participatory modeling exercise and really develop methods where we actually piloted it. We took the state's diversion modelers who worked for the Water Institute. So we do a lot of work for the state. And I should mention, when you do work for the state, your science is oftentimes rejected by coastal communities because of who funded it. So there's an issue where the coastal residents not only don't trust the state, but they don't trust the science funded by the state. So that's kind of the background to this whole situation. So one thing we did, we said, what happens if we bring the diversion modelers down to ground zero of anti-diversion sentiment, and let's really understand, let them work with the modelers. We'll deconstruct the models and rebuild them. Let's use their local knowledge. Let's show them how models are built. Let's incorporate, if they say your input vegetation maps are wrong here, let's incorporate that in, and let's bring them into the science building process. So that's kind of the background on what we did in going into St. Bernard. So over an 8-month period in 2018, we began a project to co-design and ground test a suite of hydrodynamic models for the Breton Sound estuary. And this co-development process was done in partnership with local resource users, the traditional ecological knowledge experts in St. Bernard. And this is a community that will be, as I mentioned, directly impacted by the sediment diversions. So that's kind of the background to this whole process. And I will get into a little bit where we've taken this since this earlier project. But really, our methods involved engaging with local communities, pulling together what we call an environmental competency group of about 15 residents and scientists. We brought the scientists and the residents together, and over an 8-month period, we rebuilt the models. We explained what a model domain was. We went through this whole process where the community had ownership of the final model that was developed. And then at the end, we designed projects with the community members and ran it through the models. So where they have these alternative ideas, well, maybe this will work better than the diversion. Or what happens if we don't have the diversion and we run this? What happens if we restore the entire ecosystem to what it looked like in the 1930s, which obviously is not physically possible, but let's do it and run the models and see what that looks like. So the competency group consisted of 10 residents and 6 scientists. And I'll mention as an aside, although I say scientists here, the terminology we use was very specific, and the residents we refer to as our local knowledge experts. The scientists are our technical knowledge experts. Both of these groups are knowledge experts. And what we tried to do was not elevate one group of knowledge experts over another. So everyone is treated on an equal plane. And the meetings were organized and scheduled to get feedback and insight from the locals about the condition of the Breton Sound estuary. And all the meetings, and it was led by myself and one of our anthropologists. The meetings were recorded, transcribed, coded, and analyzed in MaxQDA. So there was very strict qualitative methods that were used to analyze the data that came out of these workshops, in addition to the geospatial outputs, which I'll show in just a second. And also, residents were compensated for their time. So each meeting, recognizing that we were paid to be down there, the scientists were paid to be down there, the residents were also compensated for their time. Now, the traditional ecological knowledge gathered through this process was used to actually update the model that was used of Louisiana in its coastal master plan, this integrated compartment model or ICM model. And we also used a Delft 3D model and updated that using this participatory modeling process. Now, as we went through, one of the first things we had to really focus on was 100% transparency with the residents. If there's something, when they say, can you model my duck blind? Well, knee-jerk reaction is, well, no, we can't model your duck blind. But the realistic answer is, yes, your duck blind can be modeled, but it would require a computing capacity far beyond what we have, and it would take far too long to do it. And you explain model grid size, things like that. And if you can't account for something, you let them know. And we developed 2 models, one that could be run really quickly where we could get the results back to them by the next meeting, or another one that could take much longer to run. We explain the differences between them. If your grid size is much larger, we can run it. We can run it more quickly. But we went through, when they said, they looked at it, they're like, well, you need to include mangroves in this. For the fast model, it's already included. For the slow model, it would take us extra time to be able to include that. For some things, can we include the impacts of oyster reefs on this? Well, the reefs are too small for the grid size. We don't just say no to them. We go back and say, this is why we can't include it. It's not, because a part of the problem is they often feel like their input is ignored by the scientific community and the state and things like that. But if we're not going to include something, we very specifically note and let them know why not. So overall, the concerns of the residents, they wanted to see wetland areas remain for future generations. They wanted to see hydrological restoration. They were very interested, obviously, in the diversion operation, running at different CFS levels, just a lot of issues related to the diversions. There was issues with subsidence. Some of the, this is the amount of technical knowledge by our local knowledge experts. They said, we don't believe the subsidence rates that the state's using are accurate. Can you run your models using this subsidence rate? Yes, we can do that. And let's look at water quality issues. So there were a lot of things that came up with the community members. But one of the first things we did in this process was, it starts with these local knowledge mapping workshops. We go in with the community. We have the paper maps. We stand around a table. We mark them up. We record what they're saying so we can make sure if they say we want to include this terracing project or this marsh creation project or this reforestation project, what are the goals? What do they expect to see out of it? Let's make sure that what we see on the map and what they tell us match, that they mesh. Let's talk about future conditions. Do they want to see us run this under hurricane conditions? What sea level rise scenarios do they want to see? Do we bring more sediment intrusions? Do we look at changing? We work with the full group to design these scenarios that we run the models through. So and as kind of the GIS side, and I'm a cultural geographer by training, so I think geospatially. So, part of this, these are just some of the maps that were developed from the breakout groups. And you can see it's kind of a, lines, arrows, words, drawing, all of this spread across the process. And this is two of our breakout groups that the outputs came. And this is locations where suggested nature-based solutions could work and address their concerns. Now, one of the things we did when we got back to the office is, before the next meeting and in preparation, taking all of these data, first things first, let's go through, someone identifies, they circle this area and say, we want to do marsh creation here. First thing we do is go into the GIS, put the circles in, everything that they mark on all of these maps, let's put in, let's bring this in. But we look, and obviously, you don't have to be a modeler or a geologist to look at these polygons and say, well, this doesn't really tell us anything. So the next step we had to do is, let's look at the landscape features. Let's take what we see here. These are the areas they mark, these kind of broad areas. Let's fit it to the landscape. So we translate that into what we see here. And it's like, okay, if they want marsh creation here, or they want ridge restoration, we have to go back and look historically, where were those ridges? So we went through, adapted our models to the landscape and their project ideas. So what we're seeing here is the final project footprints of a lot of the nature-based solutions that were developed with the community. And then we went back with them, let them review it and said, is this about what, this is what we heard, this is what we got from, and go in, let's tweak these, let's change these, let's adapt these a bit to make sure, okay, these are exactly what we want to see. And then, then we did, let's assign each of the projects a project number. What's the description? What's the hazard that they want to run through the model? What's the model utilized? So, if we're going to fill in these pipeline canals, they're trying to address the intrusion, saltwater intrusion into these areas, and we're going to run that on the FAST model. So let's go through, really flesh out. And again, this is what came from directly from transcribing the audio from the workshops and taking their markings on the map and turning it into these project footprints. And then ultimately we run them through the models and get real model outputs. And what we provided, you can see here just some examples of some of the projects. We develop these project fact sheets where we say, well, what is the project? What do the model outputs look like? Are we building land? Are we losing land? In some cases, the middle one, well, yeah, this rock jetty does a great job of building land on that western side of it. But now look what it does on the eastern side. We're actually losing land on that side of it. And you can see that, yeah, maybe we'll need to tweak this idea. So we went through, and the final output of this was these detailed fact sheets. We provided a booklet of these fact sheets to the community that they can use when they go out for local, state, or federal funding. A lot of times the communities, there are these calls, for projects that we want to fund. There's a call for project ideas. Well, now the community has something in their hand where they say, here's a project idea. It's been, preliminary modeling was already done on it. We have this preliminary cost estimate. This is a powerful tool to hand to communities to be able to go out and get funding for the projects that they believe in. And it gives, it's a way to bring the scientific knowledge to the community and give them a powerful tool that can be used as they try to design restoration that will protect their own communities. And with that, I'm going to mention kind of that. So that was, there's ongoing work that we're doing now in other part of coastal Louisiana in the proximity of Port Fourchon, which is one of the largest oil and gas-based ports in the country. 18% of the country's oil supply comes onshore there. Port Fourchon services 90% of the deep water oil production in the Gulf, but there's also high ecological value there. A lot of habitat and fisheries that need to be protected. And the port, there's a project to deepen the passes around the port to 50 feet, and that's estimated to generate about 20 million cubic yards of fill that's going to be dredged out from the areas around there. One thing the port came to us and said, we want to do some type of beneficial use of this fill material. We don't want to just, throw it over the levee in the cheapest cost place to put it where we can. We actually want to try to generate these co-benefits. So again, the port came and said, we want to protect our infrastructure. We want to enhance ecosystem services. They want community resilience benefits. Let's talk about carbon. There's all these things that they were interested in. And this really was after piloting the work in St. Bernard, it's like, well, let's convene another environmental competency group. Let's design places where the port can put this fill. Let's use this decision-making process to help the port decide a place that will generate a lot of these co-benefits that the port is interested in, but they also recognizing their workers live in these communities. So they are very interested in protecting the communities as well. So again, a lot of words here, but our first, so we convened an environmental competency group. We had the Port Commission, its tenants, we had nearby residents, commercial and charter fishermen, camp owners, representatives from Louisiana's Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, Sea Grant, and then we had, again, the scientists, the H&H modelers, the ecologists, the geologists. We convened this environmental competency group to do this same process. Now, the photo you see on the right here, that was our first kind of our kickoff meeting, which was very much a get to know you. Let's get food, let's sit around for let's talk about the project, let's give some brief presentations. And, so we can get started because this really is about relationship building. And one thing I want you all to kind of note is the date of that first meeting. Keeping in mind that this is a process based on face-to-face engagement over multiple months. February of 2020 was when we had our very first kickoff meeting. So obviously COVID affected everything that we had to do. The tabletop mapping, all of the things we did for the local knowledge mapping, we had to figure out on the fly. I mean, we had to postpone our next meeting by a couple months as we figured out how to do this. Because what we wanted to do was we still needed to gather the data. We needed to gather the local knowledge and we had to find a way to do it online. So we actually developed some virtual GIS tools that we could use. And at this time, we were all learning Zoom. So we had Zoom, eventually we built this, this online map portal where we can let's identify sources of threat and, whether it be points, lines, polygons. So after the first meeting, it went completely virtual. The second meeting, again, as I mentioned before, the previous ones, we would print out our data, we would print out our vegetation maps that were inputs to the models, out the bathy topo, and let the residents go through and say, no, this looks wrong, you missed this vegetative planting project that's here. We got all of these maps online, and then the next meeting, let's go through a model. What is the model? All the things we talked about before. What's model uncertainty? What's a model grid? We had to do this, and there were hiccups, and virtual has its benefits. It's not a perfect replacement for in-person. So despite the successes of this, I will throw that out there that you miss a lot by losing that in person, but we still were able to gather the data we needed. We reviewed the elevation, the vegetation. Let's look at a historic hurricane that came through, and did their experience match what these model results show for this hurricane? Then the third meeting, let's identify places of value and sources of threat in your community. What is it you want to protect? What are these places of value that are at risk? What is the risk that they face? Again, all of this that we can see on here, the top map, these are the places of value that were identified through the mapping process. Sources of threat, obviously this open bay and fragmenting marsh in this whole area. Let's identify all of this because we want these projects to address these concerns of the community. If we're going to build resilience, you have to, the way community impact is impacted by these things is a direct tie into the resilience of those communities. And then as we did before, take the knowledge and data we gathered and then work on it. If we go back, this bottom one where we have the source of threat, open bay, and we need to do some marsh creation in here. Let's go back in. Let's look at, use elevation data to screen. Let's look at the amount of fill that we need. Where within these polygons can we take and build a project? So what we see here is some of the actual project footprints that were developed from this process. We went back in and found where if the water's too deep, you only have so much sediment. If the water's too deep, you're going to put it in, it's going to wash away. It has to be a viable place to put it. So we went back, developed these project footprints, and then went back with the community and had them review it. So just kind of where we are now, here's a schematic of all the different models. And there were a lot of ecological and, the Delft FM, AdCert, XBeach, all of these models that went in. But you see on the top that participatory modeling component. The community was involved in the construction of each of these. So right now we've finished the model testing and calibration, and we're going to run alternatives out to year 2050. We're also looking at the amount of carbon that can be generated. That's something the port was specifically interested in, is the amount of carbon generated, but also these other co-benefits, this community protection, community resilience. And with regard to resilience, once we got the final, a suite of 6 project alternatives, we went back to the communities and we interviewed, and showing them each of the project alternatives, we went through. We wanted to try to figure out from the community's perspective, recreational value, cultural value, educational value. If you do this project next to Highway 1, there's going to be more educational value because school teachers said, we can bring our students down. We can look at this restoration project. If you put it out in a certain area, this will support fish. This will support fish hatcheries. It's all, so we went through and did, and these are examples of the outputs, and it's really kind of measures of level of concern. So threats to ecosystems, erosion, storm-induced erosion, daily erosion, acres of mangrove. We can see one of the concerns with this particular project is invasive species. So if you put it here, we see invasives coming into this location. Same thing with impacts to wildlife and fisheries. And we do get some conflicting results, but for the most part, well, if you do this here, you're going to see more mammals and more birds, but yeah, you're going to lose your crab and shrimp. Yes, we're removing some of the, what we need for fish if we're building for birds and for land mammals. But at the same time, some of the residents recognize, well, yeah, this might not be good for adult fish, but this is great location for juvenile fish. And the same thing with impacts to humans. We're filling in our navigable waterways here. It's going to be difficult for us to get from point A to point B because you're filling in this channel we use every day. But this is going to affect our recreational or subsistence fishing. This is going to affect our commercial seafood harvest, but it's going to reduce wave impacts. It's going to reduce wave impacts on infrastructure. So there's identifying all of these different trade-offs and costs and benefits. And that's the process we're in now, is kind of looking at these costs and benefits. And then ultimately the final phase of this, and the modeling is still going to be who are modelers, and I'm not, but here's another delay. It's going to be a couple more weeks. We have to debug this one. It's like, okay, here we go. But the idea is we have all the models, we have our community input, and that's what's going to be used to drive the final project selection. And the difference between this and the previous project is the sediment is going to be there, and this is going to result in an actual project built on the ground that was co-developed by the communities and the stakeholders in the region. So again, please don't have to read all the language, but the idea is, if we really need to integrate local knowledge with accumulated technical scientific knowledge, if we really want to understand these complex linkages of everything that goes on in coastal areas. And the methods we use, it has to be rigorous, replicable, and accessible forms of collecting local knowledge. If our collection of local knowledge isn't as rigorous as the quote unquote hard sciences, it's not going to be respected. We have to fight the ability that science is soft science. We can collect it in a manner that can be used in the models. And qualitative data analysis is really integral to defining the and variables. And also, if you're going to monitor a project, it's vital to gather local knowledge if you're going to monitor any of these projects. And finally, you have to engage with stakeholders early and often in the process. As soon as a project is announced, your social impacts are beginning. Before the first shovel even hits the ground, as soon as the project's announced, your social impacts are, as we saw with the diversion process, people are, before it's even built, people are in their camps. So it's important, it's vital to include stakeholders early and often in the process. And the last thing I'll mention, this is related to the St. Bernard project. We actually had 4 publications on this, and the thing I really want to focus on is looking at the fields, because I think this type of research is, it's being increasingly recognized across disciplines. We had a publication in the Journal of Hydraulic Engineering. We had, on the ecology side, we have ecological engineer, professional geographer, and then Journal of Geographical Systems, which is a GIS journal. So there is a need and a desire for this project, for this type of project and this type of transdisciplinary research. I guess the last thing I'll mention related to this, it's sometimes it's not an easy sell. I think one of the articles we had, I mean, it was the journal editor for one said, I really love this. I don't think it's a fit for us. Here's some other suggestions where you might want to try this. One of the articles they came back and said, we couldn't find a reviewer we couldn't find the reviewers to review this. And the second choice for that publication, it actually got the article of the year from that journal after being, not making it into another journal because they couldn't find the right group of reviewers. So the time is ripe for this, and the amount of work that's being done, and I think it's much needed, especially with the increased focus in equity and the Justice 40 initiative, all of these new processes going on now. This type of community engagement in the modeling process is vital. I'd also like to say we've had, the funding for this came from several, public-private partnership, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, Baton Rouge Area Foundation, and of course, CPRA, our Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority in Louisiana. So yep, we did have state funding and had to acknowledge that right off the bat with our stakeholders. And with that, I'm available for any questions.
Thanks, Scott. That was wonderful. We have about 10 minutes for questions. I'm sure, yes, we have a lot of them. First question, I'm going to give it to Thomas Thalen. You want to unmute yourself?
Hey, Scott, thanks for that presentation. That was really excellent. So you went through a couple examples of this participatory modeling process in Louisiana.
Yeah.
Can you think of a project that you've noticed like outside of Louisiana where either you thought, oh, they could have really benefited from some participatory modeling here, or some of your methods could have been applied and maybe help that project gain traction in the community where it was proposed?
Outside of the scientific literature, I will say a lot of, Corps of Engineers projects. I think this type of process, I think, needs to be incorporated into federal decision making. At least bringing them into some of those. So that's what I would say is a lot of the kind of planning efforts, and really in the applied realm, and kind of reviewing some of the and it doesn't necessarily have to be the Corps. I use that as the most obvious example, but any nature-based solution project that we see, whether it's funded by US Fish, or I think this type of engagement, I think, needs to be part of that process. And to what degree is obviously going to vary from project to project. And I would say that kind of increasing federal focus on identifying benefits of projects, I think, makes this type of work ripe for being used in federal projects. Things that in the past had been said, well, this is too difficult to do these types of outcomes. Now that there's a need to show 40% benefit, suddenly these things that were too difficult to do will be more readily implemented.
Makes
But
sense. Thank you.
there is literature on participatory modeling, and the environmental competency group for flood protection. There are good examples kind of globally of the environmental competency group approach. We kind of followed really the genesis of that for some flood work in the UK, and then adapted that down here. So there are, in the literature, we are kind of building off of previous work that has been done.
Very cool.
Great, thanks, Scott. Up next, Laura.
Hi, Scott. Really enjoyed your talk. It's great to hear about this work. And we recently put together a proposal, and Seacoast hopes to do some participatory modeling on the North Carolina coast. And I'm really interested in hearing a little bit more about the process that you used for recruiting and selecting your local knowledge experts. And then do you have anyone on your team or that you're working with who is looking at understanding how sort of the benefits of working with this smaller team expand to the buy-in across the community? And sort of, I would imagine it's very careful. It's very important to choose or to work with local experts who really are connected across the community in a way that the benefit expands beyond the team.
Right. Yeah. So to your first question with the selection of it was it was a long process. It was a lot of kind of, yeah, I think it's finding those key organizations. In Louisiana, we have Louisiana Sea Grant, for example, and they're extension agents. So let's reach out to the extension agents and see who they think we should talk to. But also just, you kind of identify, and it's really a snowball sampling method where you identify one person, you kind of talk to them and say, well, who else would you recommend? Or if you can't do it, is there someone else you recommend? And then, you know, kind of find who bubbles up through this process, because the benefit of that is this really needs to be a small group process. I don't, it can work in a charrette size, and we've done similar things with larger groups but for this kind of extended engagement, I think limiting that size, so it's kind of building the personal relationships, but that's where that identifying that initial group of stakeholders and seeing who do we get the most recommendations from is vital for this. And as for expanding it out, that is one of, particularly with the Fushan project, because that's one that is being constructed. We needed to move beyond just that initial group. And so we went back, there were people when we were recruiting people, they said, you know, we can't take part in, you know, the full 8-month process, but we would love to have feedback at the end. So we had that list of those individuals and then gathered additional stakeholders after. So when we did the interviews after, and kind of charts that I showed at the end, the wheel charts, that wasn't just with the competency group. We kind of reached out to broader groups of stakeholders. So we found, you know, let's find the local paddling group and see, okay, what's this going to do for you going out and kayaking here? Let's find some fishermen. Now, I'm going to caveat that and say that process was cut short by Hurricane Ida. We were in the middle of our interviews at this Fushan, and this whole area is ground zero. That's where Ida made landfall. We made the decision, and rightfully so, we're ending the interviews. We're not going to be trying to hound people down as they're trying to get houses. Right. So the idea was we were going to have a much broader group of stakeholders, and we did, but I think we're aiming for, I'd say probably 30 to 40 interviews. I think we were at 15 when Ida hit, and we stopped with that, and then talked to our regular competency group also.
Thanks, that's great. I'd imagine representative group that really touches on the different aspects important to the community is important. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Scott, can you exit your slides so we can see other people that are asking questions? Awesome, thank you.
There you go.
Okay, Joe, go ahead.
Hi, Scott. Thanks. I think it's a really impressive framework. There's an obvious buy-in when people are included in the model development and the model inputs and those kinds of things. And I'm wondering if you ran across any situations, I know you're still doing a lot of the modeling, but where the model result doesn't fit the intuition that they might have. And do you get pushback, or what happens in that scenario, or has that not happened?
It's, to some extent, that's where that letting them take part in building the model. So if it didn't match like some of the projects that we ran through the model in the St. Bernard project, these are things that they're like, we've been testing this like all the time and doing it. And then when you see, okay, yeah, it does, their local knowledge is right, it's going to build land here, but then you have this detrimental effect over here. And it's kind of through the buy-in process, it's accepted. Not 100%. It's not, because they also recognize the uncertainty in the models. But I think it's not like, oh, this is garbage, it doesn't work. And kind of anecdotally, when our ecologist ran into one of the fishermen at a conference, she was like, okay, off the record, tell me, how did this work? And he's like, we felt like it was the first time we were listened to. And then he's like, so-and-so, fisherman X, he was like, there was a public meeting, and some fishermen's like, we need to try this. And one of the fishermen stood up and said, no, man, we can't do that. We already modeled it. It didn't work. And it was like, hearing that anecdotal story, I'm like, that means more to me than any of those publications, because it's like, well, dang, that actually trust the model results and said, we tried that, it doesn't work. So
Amazing.
Okay, I saw a couple more hands raised, but it looks like they were down. There were a couple of notes in the chat from Rick Ludick and Christine, just thanking you, Scott, for presenting, and they were excited to see the progress made by the Water Institute. So with that, I think we're going to stop for today. Thank you so much for attending. Thanks to both of our speakers. These were really great talks, and we will see you in a couple of weeks. Or many weeks. March 24th, we'll be having a synthesis discussion. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good day.
Yeah, please
you.
join us next time. Thanks, Scott and Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you
Yeah,
both.
thanks for
That's great.
inviting us. Yeah, that was fun.
Really
They're
great and
fantastic.
went well together too. which
Yes.
is-
We
Yeah.
need to,
Yes.
we need to combine the work, I think. and do some surveying
You need
see
to
how
come to
well the
North
attitudes are
Carolina.
being changed.
Yeah.
And I
Well-
want to start the survey in the Gulf.
Yeah, how do we, let's, to answer the last question, let's take the survey and let's, once we get the project things, design a survey and send it out,
Yeah.
that we can reach the broader public with some of these ideas.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Definitely
Yeah.
linkages.
And if we
All
get
right.
funded, we'll
Yeah.
call you, because participatory modeling and household surveys would be ongoing in tandem. So
Yep.
yeah.
So Laura, I think, I don't know if you remember this, but in the National Academy study we were on together on the Gulf, longitudinal